Hi everybody, welcome to Godly Play. Today's story is one where we're going to learn more about Jacob. If you remember last week's story, we talked about Jacob. He was Isaac's son and he had a twin brother named Esau. And you may remember that Jacob and his mother tricked Esau out of his inheritance by getting Isaac's blessing. And Esau was very angry. So at the end of the story, Jacob had been told by his mother to go to her family. Her family lived in Haran, and there he should find a wife because it was time for him to marry. Jacob thought this was very good advice, particularly since his brother, who was much larger and stronger than he was very angry and was threatening to kill him. So Jacob set out for Haran. And on the way, he stopped at one point and he decided to go to sleep. And he used a rock as his pillow. And while he was sleeping, he had a dream. He dreamed he saw a ladder going all the way up to heaven. And there were angels going up and down the ladder. And in the dream, God told Jacob that he was going to have a great family and that this land would belong to him and his family forever. So Jacob woke up and he continued on his journey to Haran. And when he arrived, he saw a beautiful young woman, and she had brought her sheep down. She was taking care of the sheep. They belonged to her father Laban. Turned out that Laban was the brother of Jacob's mother. And this was Rachel. And Jacob went to his uncle and said, I would like to marry Rachel. And Laban said, well, that could be arranged, but I want you to work for me for 7 years. Jacob agreed. And for 7 years, he worked and he took care of Laban's sheep and all of his goods. And while he was doing that, Laban became very wealthy because he was doing such a good job. Now, 7 years passed by, and it was time for the wedding. And when Jacob turned to his bride and removed her veil, he discovered that he had not married Rachel. He had married her older sister, Leah. Jacob was rather put out about this, and his uncle told him, well, you know, if you work another 7 years, you can marry Rachel also. In that day, men often had more than one wife. So Jacob worked another 7 years, and at the end of that time, he was allowed to marry Rachel. Now, he did very well. He continued to work for his uncle. He worked for Laban for 21 years, and he had a lot of children. He had 12 sons. And one daughter named Dinah. And one day, God told Jacob that it was time for him to go back to his original home. And he was a little worried about this because he thought Esau was probably still quite angry with him. But he gathered up his family and all their servants, and they went back. And he was very worried about meeting Esau. And the night before this was to happen, he was asleep. And all of a sudden, he found himself struggling with someone. He didn't know who it was, but they sort of fought and wrestled all night long. And at one point, this stranger touched his hip and it went out of joint. But Jacob didn't give up. He continued to hang on and fight until dawn. And at that point, the stranger revealed himself to be an angel. And he told him that his family would reproduce and go on, and he would create a whole new nation, and it would be called Israel. And that is what Jacob was to be called from now on, Israel. So the next day, it was time to meet Esau. And Jacob sent gifts and presents ahead. And then he was still very, very nervous, and he had all of his family and all of his servants around him, and Esau was coming with 400 men. But when Esau came and saw Jacob, he fell down in front of him, and he was so happy to see him, and he hugged him, and he said he was so glad to see his brother after all those years, and he had forgiven him for what he had done. So, this story makes me wonder a lot of things. Perhaps the first thing I wonder what it would be like would be to have 12 siblings. That would be one big family. I wonder what it was like for Jacob too when he was fooled by his father-in-law, and I wonder how that would make you feel. And I wonder what it would be like to be so afraid when he was going back to meet Esau, and then have Esau welcome him and be so happy to see him again. Maybe you could wonder some things about this story too, and you could let us know what sort of things you're wondering. All right, we'll see you again next week.